I want to welcome you back to another AP Art History conversation, and today we're talking about Greek art and particularly the Archaic period. Now, there's a prior video to this, and that's covering art of the geometric period, and that's going to give you some more of the historical context. If you're interested in understanding the historical context behind Greek art, I suggest you go back and find my video on the geometric period. And so we're going to begin our conversation on the Archaic period, which occurs between right around 600 BCE to 480 BCE. So what is the Archaic period? Well, just to kind of give you some reference, this is really the third period in Greek art history, because we have the geometric period, we have this really brief period called the Orientalization period, and then we have the Archaic, and then we get into the Classicals, and the Classicals are the early, the high, and the late, and then we have Hellenism. The Archaic period does not really earn the name archaic. Archaic means antiquated, it means old-fashioned, and in some terms it's even seen as primitive. And the term was actually chosen by art historians who really wanted to stress what they perceived as this juxtaposition between undeveloped art of the time and the subsequent classical period. So this is sort of like a subset. We're going to divide this period, which seems to be antiquated, which seems to be old-fashioned or even primitive, archaic, to what we really see as Greek art. That is, the classical, the early, the high, and the late classical, Hellenistic. So that kind of gives you a little bit of idea of how the Archaic period gets its name. This period was a time of great achievement architecturally. We could spend an entire lesson talking about temples, and that'll be later on. This is going to be about freestanding sculptures. We also see this is a great time for literature, particularly with like Aesop crafting his animal fables. We also have Sappho, who wrote her inspired poetry. We see that artists and architects are growing in prosperity as city councils and wealthy individuals who are trading in the Mediterranean are beginning to sponsor the creation of sculptures and fine ceramic wares. They are commissioning elaborate buildings and religious buildings, temples, as well as sanctuaries. So this is what the Archaic period is all about, and we'll all be talking about the characteristics of the Archaic period as we look at our freestanding sculptures. So today's video podcast is about the freestanding sculptures that we see in the Archaic period. And this is a new type of freestanding statue. Some of them are made of wood, others were made out of terracotta. Terracotta is an important AP art history vocabulary, or art history vocabulary, that is clay that's fired over a real low heat. And sometimes these terracotta sculptures are unglazed. We see in the Archaic period, we see sculptures done in limestone or white marble. And we see this white marble coming from the island of Paros and Naxos. That's my best Greek. It's my job to screw this stuff up. And we have to understand that all of these paintings, like you see here of this Koros, they were all brightly painted. And sometimes they had inscriptions and indicated the individual, who this man is or who this woman is, and who had it commissioned for commemorative purposes. Now I have to understand that there are male and female freestanding sculptures. If you're looking at a female statue, it's called a kore, K-O-R-E. Korai, if we're talking about many. And kore in Greek means young woman. And a male statue is known as a koros or a koroi if it's plural, and that is Greek for, you got it, young man. So archaic korai, the women always were clothed. A woman probably represented deities, could have been a priestess, or nymphs, which are young female immortals who serve as attendants or assistants to the gods. The koroi nearly were always nude, and it may have been various identifications as a god. They may have been seen as a warrior, or they might have been seen as victorious athletes. Because the Greeks associated young, athletic males with the idea of family continuity as well as fertility, the koroi figures may have also have been symbolized as ancestors. So let's begin our conversation here with this metropolitan Koros. This is dating to about 600 BCE, and as you look at this, and if you've studied your Egyptian sculpture, your freestanding sculpture, this looks a lot like Egyptian pose and proportions. Okay, we have a young Greek. He's standing rigidly upright. His arms are at his side. Fists are clenched. You got that one leg slightly in front of the other. However, the artist who created this has cut away all the stone from around the body, unlike our Egyptians, to make him more human-like, more freestanding. And the koroi are also much less lifelike than their Egyptian counterparts. The anatomy is delineated with linear lines and grooves that form regular symmetrical patterns. The head is ovoid. We have a wig-like hair that's even knotted into tufts, and sometimes we see it with a little hair scrunchie in the back, some sort of tied back with a narrow ribbon. Now look at those eyes. It kind of makes a throwback to the Mesopotamian period. Those eyes are large. They are wide open. The mouth is forming a conventional, this is the rule, closed lip expression, and you've got to remember this. That's called the archaic smile. And if we look at Egyptian sculpture, the male figures usually wore clothing. Here we have a nude figure. Egyptians had their clothing was always associated with status. They had necklaces, they had headdresses, they wore a kilt that would identify them as a king. The total nudity of the Greek koroi is unusual in ancient Mediterranean cultures, but it became acceptable except for one thing: women. Women were never seen in the nude. So now let's look at a female freestanding sculpture, a core. This is known as the Berlin core. And this was done probably about 30 to 40 years after our metropolitan Koros. The Berlin core is actually a funerary statue. It was found in a cemetery. Again, just like the metropolitan Koros, we have a very erect full body figure that takes this immobile pose. The one difference we see here is that her legs are side by side versus the metropolitan Koros that has that sort of Egyptian stepping forward. She wears a thick robe and tassel cloak over her shoulders and falls in this sort of regularly spaced symmetrical element, parallel folds like the fluting that we would see on, say, a Greek column. And the drapery masks her body. It almost hides her body, but also mimics her curving contours. If you look closely, or if you do a Google search, you'll see that on the drapery we see traces of red, which indicate, like other paintings, this was painted. It indicates that the robe was once painted, or it might have been gilded with gold. Now in her right hand she holds a pomegranate in her right hand, and it's a symbol. And this is a symbol of Persephone, who was abducted by Hades in the myth, and the god who is the god of the underworld, and whose annual return indicates the bringing of springtime. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier video on the geometric period, I said that Greek artists were a restless sort of people, and here's a perfect example. This is still archaic, this particular freestanding sculpture, but yet it's like 70 to possibly 80 years after the metropolitan Koros was created. This is the Anaviosos, I guess that's what it is. I could be totally wrong, which I typically am. Koros, and what we have is such a leap from what we saw earlier in the metropolitan Koros. We have a powerful, athletic figure, rounded shoulders, and this is about 530 BCE. And it really shows this increasing interest of artists and those that are commissioning the artists to create more lifelike renderings of the human figure. The pose, the wigged hair, that archaic smile, all conventional, echoes that earlier style. The massive torso, the limbs have yet been carefully rendered, and we see muscularity suggesting again the symbolism of heroic strength. And the statue is a grave monument to a fallen warrior. How do we know? At the base it says, "Stop and grieve at the tomb of the dead Croesus, who was slain by the wild Ares, god of war, in front of rank of battle." So we're going to look at another female core that's about 40 years, maybe 30 years from the Berlin core. This is known as the Peplos core. It was done about the same time as the work we just looked at, though this figure is a votive figure rather than a funerary statue. She has a rounded body form, unlike the work we just looked at, and like our Berlin core, she is clothed. She has the same motionless, the same vertical pose as our Berlin core, but her bare arms and her head convey more flesh, more soft flesh, covering sort of this real skeletal structure. And if you look at her smile and her hair, they're considerably less stylized. Again, painted, both the body and the clothes, and it would have made her seem more lifelike. And she might have worn a metal crown, and she might have had some jewelry. The name that is used for this figure is based on this sort of assessment of her clothing as a young girl, the peplos. Now, a peplos is a draped rectangle of cloth pinned at the shoulders and belted to kind of give a bloused effect. The core is actually not wearing a peplos, but almost a sheet-like garment. Originally, again, painted with a frieze of animals, identifying her not as a young girl for purposes, but as a goddess. So she might have been Athena or Artemis. Her missing left arm, which means that this was done in two pieces, because you could not sculpt away because of gravity, made of a separate piece of marble, would have extended forward horizontally, and she may have held an attribute that provided some sort of key to her identity. Some believe that she might have held a pomegranate, she might have held a staff of some sort, but we're not really sure. So one of the things at AP Art History and in art history in our college classes, we're always looking for that evolution, that change over time in art. And what we have here are two works of art that are roughly 60 to 70 years apart from each other. And again, this kind of plays into the idea that Greek artists, particularly sculptors, were a restless sort of people. And were they being pushed by their patrons, or were they pushing themselves to kind of find that idealized form? So as you look at this, you could pause the video or you can go into your textbook. You have to ask yourself, what changes occurred between these two pieces that are in the same time period? Just that they're 60 to 70 years apart. So you should always be able to make that list of things that are going along, okay? I'm seeing a better anatomy between the work on the left and the work on the right. The second thing you have to ask yourself is, what characteristics stayed the same? Obviously, we want to say the archaic smile stayed the same. The rigid pose, the clenched fists, and that stepping forward. Those are elements that stayed the same. You have to ask yourself, well, why did they stay the same? Was it just easier to do it that way? Well, this brings us to the end of the Archaic period. And so just to kind of review, the Archaic period follows the geometric and that brief Orientalizing art periods. Okay, it happens between 600 and 480 BCE, and historically the Greeks are out colonizing the Mediterranean world. And anyway, you have to remember that why do cultures colonize? It's because their cities are getting overcrowded, and how to deal with overcrowding before things get out of hand. You tell people, hey, I've got a boat, we're going to give you some food, we're going to give you some money, go out into the world and go colonize other areas. And that's how art gets transferred from one culture to another culture. We see literature is flourishing at this time, as we talked about Sappho writing her inspired poetry and Aesop creating his fables. And we finally see that artists of this time period and architects, as temples are being built and sanctuaries are being built, are gaining in prosperity as local officials, city-state governments are sponsoring the creation of sculptures. They're creating architecture. And they're also doing ceramic wares, which is another conversation. Hey, thanks for joining me today in our video podcast on Greek art in the Archaic period.